Hi, everyone. We want to get started because we have so much going on tonight. So, hello and welcome. My name is Whitney Donhauser, and I am the Ronay Menschel Director here at the Museum of the City of New York. Thank you all for joining us to celebrate our Activist New York exhibition, which explores the historical and contemporary issues that New Yorkers have felt passionate about and compelled to address. Tonight, we are so pleased to highlight the exhibition's new companion book, Activist New York, A History of People, Protest, and Politics, and our newest case study about the anti-Vietnam War movement in New York City, which is installed in our Puffin Foundation Gallery. So the Activist New York, yay, that's great. So the Activist New York exhibition, publication, and associated programs are made possible by the Puffin Foundation under a shared mission of exploring the ways in which ordinary New Yorkers have exercised their power to shape the city and the nation's future. I extend my heartfelt thank you to Perry, Gladys, and Neil Rosenstein, who are here tonight with us. We truly appreciate your transformative support for the museum. So to begin tonight, we are thrilled to welcome three inspiring youth activists, Brea Baker, Ramon Contreras, and Hebh Jamal, for a conversation led by the journalist Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! So please note that while we will not be taking questions from the audience following the discussion, we really invite all of you to continue the conversation afterwards at a reception on the museum's second floor. And of course, you also have an opportunity on the second floor to see the Activist New York exhibition. But at 8 o'clock, I want to let you know that in our rotunda, which is on the first floor, we're thrilled to be able to feature an original performance by a group of young musicians from Carnegie Hall's Future Music Project Ensemble. So thank you to Carnegie Hall and the Future Music Project Ensemble for their participation tonight. Now, I would love everyone to turn off anything that buzzes or beeps, just to make sure. But I'd also, if anyone is inclined to tweet, you can tweet using the hashtag Activist New York, or Activist NY, let me be clear. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Steve Jaffe, who is a curator here and an author of our new Activist New York book, and Sarah Seidman, who is the Puffin curator of social activism and the curator of our ongoing Activist New York exhibition. So they'll offer some brief introductions before we begin this conversation. So thank you in joining and helping me join Steve and Sarah out on stage. Thanks.
Thank you, Whitney, and thank you all for being here tonight. And thank you to Perry, Gladys, and Neil for making this all possible. We're going to, both of us, I think, are going to keep this really short this evening so we can get to the program. But I wanted to kick things off with a quote, a historical quote that I think is relevant. And this is a quote from the 19th century. The person who said it was not a New Yorker, although he did write for a New York City newspaper, the Daily Tribune, for a while. This person was a German political refugee in England, in London, named Karl Marx. And towards the end of his life, someone asked Karl Marx what he thought the meaning of life was. And he answered with one word: struggle. And now, obviously, you don't have to be a Marxist to believe that that struggle is the meaning of life. For that matter, you don't have to agree that struggle is the meaning of life. But I think that that story is very relevant for what we have accomplished here and tried to accomplish over the years through the good graces of the Puffin Foundation in the various intersecting Activist New York programs, the exhibition, and now this book. Struggle certainly has been a major part of New York City's history from the very beginning, and certainly also struggles by young people to try to change the society, the city, and the larger society for the better in any variety of ways, whether you're talking about the teenagers who fought alongside George Washington in the Continental Army. Many of them were very young, the soldiers. Or whether you're talking about the young immigrant Jewish and Italian women who launched the so-called uprising of 20,000 in 1909, who revolutionized the cities and really arguably the nation's labor movement, or the high school students and college students who Sarah's about to talk about in terms of the 1960s and the anti-Vietnam War movement. So without going any further, I think we believe here, one of our mandates here is that to understand the present and the future of New York City, you have to understand something about its past. And that's sort of a motive, an MO for many things we do here. Specifically, as already mentioned, we are very proud and happy to have this book out as a companion volume now to the ongoing activist New York exhibition. As the Puffin Foundation can attest, it's been a long, long time coming, and we're all delighted now that it's out. If you're interested, which I hope you are, in the way in which the history of New York activism, in all of its variety and complexity, ties in and gives a backdrop and a context for today's activism and tomorrow's activism, we are inviting you and hoping that you might like to purchase the book or take a look at it upstairs in the gift shop. I will be there after the program as author to sign copies if you so desire. So come take a look and enjoy the program. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all of you for being here tonight. Thank you to the Rosensteins and the Puffin Foundation for your incredible support. And yes, please join us after an Activist New York. The book and the exhibition trace activism from, the 17th century through pretty much today. I've been thinking a lot about 1968 and the 60s recently, given that it's 50 years later, and we just completed a new section on the Vietnam War and organizing around Vietnam. So please come take a look, and I know we'll hear more tonight about what has changed, what hasn't, how our approaches to activism from the past also might resonate with us today. I really just want to dive into the program, and I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's speakers, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Brea Baker currently serves as the Program and Youth Engagement Coordinator and Executive Assistant at the Gathering for Justice. And she is the youngest national organizer for the Women's March, focusing on partnerships, college mobilization, and logistics. And there are longer bios of these incredible activists in your program. Ramon Contreras is the founder of Youth Over Guns, an organization dedicated to raising awareness about gun violence in Black and brown communities. And he has organized an anti-gun march over the Brooklyn Bridge and is a strategist for March for Our Lives. Oh, yes, and please welcome our panelists as I'm speaking. Hebh Jamal emerged as a young leader in the fight against Islamophobia in 2015. Since then, she's co-created the first ever citywide youth council on school integration run by Integrate NYC. She's also youth director of New York at the Muslim American Society and vice president of her college's Students for Justice in Palestine. And of course, Amy Goodman, we're so thrilled to have here tonight as our moderator, is the host and executive producer of Democracy Now! A national daily independent award-winning news program airing on over 1,400 public television and radio stations worldwide. Her books include New York Times bestsellers, Democracy Now!, 20 Years Covering the Movements Changing America, and The Silenced Majority, Stories of Uprising, Occupations, Resistance, and Hope. So let's dive into our conversation. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you. Take it away, Amy.
Wow. What an amazing honor it is to be here with all of you and to be here particularly with you all on this day after, or 2 days after, the midterm elections that will see, for the first time in U.S. history, 100 women will serve in Congress. The first 2 Muslim American women will take their seat in Congress. Rashida Tlaib is not only a Muslim American woman, but a Palestinian American woman. We'll be interviewing her tomorrow on Democracy Now! And Ilhan Omar is the first hijab-wearing Muslim woman, and the first refugee, a Somali American, to take her seat in Congress. We have the first 2 Latina women taking their seat from Texas in Congress. The first openly gay male governor will become the governor of Colorado. The first 2 Native American women will take their seat in Congress. And so many of these firsts share the same platform, at least $15 an hour minimum wage, a living wage, calling for Medicare for all, calling for dealing with climate change and racial and economic justice. And it is an amazing moment. I think what we're seeing right now is the wall that President Trump figuratively and literally represents has become a door. The question is whether that door will be kicked open or slammed shut. And that's not to even the elected leaders, but all of you, here and all over the country. And I think 3 of those people are right here, right now, and that's who we want to hear from. I'd like to get a fresh microphone. I'm not sure if it's better or worse. I'd like to get a... I think this is worse. It's not on. I'll keep that one. I'd like to get a fresh mic every 3 or 4 minutes when I'm speaking. Testing. How is this? Good, good. So let's begin with Brea Baker. I want to talk about the midterm elections, but let's just go back 2 years to a remarkable gathering that took place a day after Donald Trump's inauguration. And this was not one gathering, but many all over the country, the Women's March, as it was called. Brea, you were a key part of organizing for that, and you've spent your life doing this work. So talk about organizing leading up to the midterm elections.
Yes, well, first, I would be remiss to talk about the successes that we had yesterday and not to talk about Florida with the ballot initiative to restore the right to vote to 1.4 million people. So I have to start there. But I think that also ties into what my organizing leading up to these midterms was, because it wasn't enough to just get out the vote. We had to acknowledge that a lot of people want to vote and can't and are actively prohibited from doing that, and that most of those people come from Black and brown communities. But yes, I think that there was so much energy ahead of the midterms, especially with youth. The youth vote went up 10%. Young people came out in droves. Elections that were previously won, like Texas, by millions of people are now at recounts or we're only won by 200,000, or we're still trying to figure out in Florida and Georgia. So regardless of what happens in those spaces, I think what we saw was that we finally took an organizing approach to getting out the vote, and recognizing that success isn't always just getting our person through that door, but about moving our people to care, to invest themselves in the face of so much voter suppression, in the face of so many people who want them to stay home, and choosing to go out and choosing to organize their communities and choosing to drive people to the polls, choosing to ask for provisional ballots, choosing to check up on those provisional ballots today and make sure that they're being counted. So that was really what made me excited about organizing ahead of the midterms. And what I hope everyone is taking as a win is, regardless of the areas that we didn't bring home, we still have 2020. We have Florida that is maybe not going to be such a swing state anymore now with these 1.4 million other people who are able to vote again. We have young people who are begging to vote. Like, I've talked to so many young people that I organized with who were like, I can't wait to vote. I was so jealous that you got to vote today. And I'm like, what? We've never seen discourse like that. Jealous that you got to vote. Like, it was a privilege that I got to vote, and that's what I hope stays. I hope we don't make voting popular, but we make it normal. So, yeah.
You know, what you said, Brea, about Amendment 4 in Florida. This is a constitutional amendment that passed by close to 70%. 1.4 million Floridians who have felonies on the record. Many of them never even served time in jail. Yeah. As Desmond Meade, who was one of the key people to organize this amendment, said, how many of you have ever released a helium balloon into the air? Or made a memorial service, maybe a white balloon? Do you know in Florida, you've committed a third-degree felony? You could lose your right to vote forever. And he went on and gave us examples like these. And the fact that George W. Bush won Florida, and which meant he won the country in 2000 by something like 500 votes in Florida. Donald Trump won Florida, which helped him win the country by something like a little more than 110,000 votes. This is now the largest enfranchisement of Americans since
the Voting Rights Act.
The Voting Rights Act, young people getting the right to vote from 21 to 18, and going back 100 years, women getting the right to vote in 1920. Yeah. This is massive what it will mean for 2020.
Yeah. I mean, even, I don't think people know this fact, but in Alabama with Doug Jones becoming the first Democratic governor in decades. Senator. Excuse me, senator in decades. That vote happened right after formerly incarcerated people were restored their right to vote in Alabama, and 114,000 people who were never allowed to vote before voted in that election. So people are not really weighing what that will mean for elections and what that will mean for, you know, states that have been historically red was because people were silenced. It's not that those states are actually majority conservative, it's that the people who would be voting for progressives have been forced out of that. And we're forcing them back in, and it's beautiful. And yeah, I'm just so excited about it.
So we're going to turn to Ramon Contreras. Ramon, if you can talk about the beginning of your activism and how it led you now to be involved in electoral politics, getting people to vote and be heard, and particularly on this day of 1,000 Oaks, where 12 people were gunned down early this morning. It is astounding to think that this is happening almost every day now. Multiple people are being killed by a single gunman. And in just the last few weeks, you know, all of the terrible violence that has all too often, from the letter bombs to the killing of the women at the yoga studio to the killing of the Jewish worshipers in Pittsburgh, a kind of violence has been unleashed in this time of, well, white supremacy politics. But Ramon, talk about what got you active.
Well, my name is Ramon Contreras. Pleasure to meet you all here today. I love this crowd already. You guys were clapping a lot in the beginning. That's usually a good sign. Oh, sorry. But I got involved my junior year towards the end of my sophomore year in high school. You know, I just wanted to find a way to give back. And I started doing community service, started doing town halls out of my school, started a school newspaper, and was just talking about police brutality, was talking about LGBTQ rights, and the small microaggressions that were going on in my community. And from there, I got the opportunity to intern and work at some pretty cool political offices. I got to work on a couple political campaigns, and I got to work at a PR firm doing you know, media relations for elected officials. But doing all that, I realized that that wasn't the work I wanted to do. On October 1st, I lost a friend to gun violence. He was shot and killed. And, you know, a couple months later, the Parkland shooting happened. And the whole country had this big uprising around gun violence, right? And to me, it wasn't surprising, but it was still shocking that although it was a tragedy, when white kids are affected by this issue that's been affecting black and brown communities for decades, suddenly the media wants to turn to them and wants to give them all the attention that they want. They want to hear those voices. And to me, I found that absolutely just ridiculous, and I wanted to do something about it. So I left the PR firm that I was working at, and I started Youth Over Guns, you know, because of my friend, because of the hundreds and thousands of black and brown people who are taken by gun violence every day that goes unnoticed. And I organized a march across the Brooklyn Bridge. I actually teamed up with Brea and the Gathering for Justice folks and Justice League NYC, Women's March people, a lot of the New York City Crisis Management System, which is a collective group of organizations that fight gun violence within the inner cities, and they mediate it. They go in before police officers have to mediate any violence, and their work is amazing. They were able to lower the gun violence by 70% in the past decade in New York City. And I teamed up with them, and we did a march across the Brooklyn Bridge where 10,000 people came as we carried a casket to symbolize the deaths in our community. And from there, it kind of sparked my activism. It taught me that my actions and my words can inspire others. And if you can inspire one person, that person can inspire another one. And after that, I had the privilege of, I know you guys heard of the March for Our Lives, Parkland students. I was able to join them on the Road to Change summer tour, where we went to over 65 cities, did 65 town halls, and went to 20-plus states where we held rallies, where we registered young people to vote at crazy numbers, and we just engaged with different communities. And that experience in itself was absolutely amazing. I got to go to Texas, where lots of angry white men followed me with AR-15s. And for me, it was kind of a surprise because I'm from New York City. You don't really see that around here.
Explain what happened in Texas.
In Texas, I'll give you one scenario, Houston, which I think speaks to a greater American story that should be shared across the world. We had a rally across the street where a couple youth activists came out to speak about gun violence and get out the vote. And then on the other side of the street, there were about 30-plus people with guns and like white supremacist flags. Proud Boys were there. And they all had AR-15s, and they were shouting us, yelling at us. Every single time we walked across the street, they would make threats to us. And I decided to cross the street and have a conversation with one of the gentlemen. And through that conversation, this man had 2 AR-15s. I don't know why he had 2 AR-15s. That's insane. He had 2 AR-15s in his back. He had a gun on his hip. He had another gun on his leg. And he was there with his son, a 14-year-old kid, screaming at other kids. That's pretty lame. But, but I had a conversation with him, and we put the politics aside. We put the bullshit aside. And we spoke about saving lives. I said, how can I make sure that your child and your life is protected? How can I make sure that my life and my future family life is protected from gun violence? And through that conversation, I listed out policy points, universal background checks, red flag laws, disarming domestic abusers. And we came to realize that we agree on a lot of the things that people say we disagree on. And that story became something very common on the road when we went to these deep red states where people love their Second Amendment. And we realized that the only place where these policy points are controversial are in Congress, not within the American people. The American people want safety. The American people want to live in an America where they're safe from violence, where they're safe from greed, where they're safe from power. And that's the story that needs to be shared. And it hurts, speaking about the mass shootings that continue to happen in this country. Waking up to this news today, it kind of sucks that when there's another mass shooting, sometimes people just read it and they say, wow, another one, right? That culture shouldn't exist in this country. And, I hope that our Congress now can take action and do more than thoughts and prayers and actually pass the legislation that we need to prevent those bad people from getting guns. This country has waited for justice way too long, and there's a quote from Martin Luther King that I think spoke to me this morning when I saw the news, and it's justice waited too long is a justice denied. And if those in Congress, new or not, Democrat or Republican, if they don't take action, then the people will. Because with the spirit and hope of the people, we can do anything.
Hebh Jamal, if you can talk about how you became active growing up here in New York City, and what's most important to you right now, and why you organize against hate.
So first of all, thank you. All right, I'll try my best. I think the mic is a little low because I'm really close, but so thank you all, thank you, Amy Goodman, and thank you for the organizers for having me here and speaking to this lovely audience. So before I, get into the concept of, why I feel like talking a little bit about my background specifically, it gives a perception of why I do what I do. As Amy said, or as I was introduced in the intro, I am, Muslim, and I'm specifically Palestinian. And although I do a lot of activism in New York City, I think it's important to talk about that aspect of my identity and why, I do the work that I do. As a Palestinian who came from parents who, came from descendants who were actually in Palestine and was in a village that is now ethnically cleansed. And I actually have a fiance who was in Gaza during the 2009 war as a 16-year-old, having to uncover the body of his best friend. And the whole perception of what it means to be human for us is through this lens of occupation, through this lens of injustice and constant resilience, trying to figure out what it means to be human in this society, right? It's constantly just trying to struggle. It's constantly fighting. And that is kind of what shapes identities for a majority of Palestinians, both here and abroad. So kind of going back to kind of what I do, yes, I am a part of a lot of Islamophobia work, but specifically, and what I found very relevant in both my Palestinian identity and the type of work that I do, I actually work tackling school segregation in New York City. And so I focus a lot on education equity. Do you guys know that New York City has one of the most segregated school systems in the country? We have one of the most segregated school systems in the country. And the story of how I got into that, I actually, so I was in the New York Times around, just my perception on like Islamophobia, the rise of Trump. I was 15 at the time. And, after I started to speak at a lot of high schools, and there was a specific high school that I spoke at, that, there was 15 students, and all the students from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, identities, religions, and I was really confused, because I came from a very elite, high school, public high school in Times Square, and I was just, the concept of diversity and inclusion was abnormal to me. Like, it didn't make sense. I go back to my own school that same day, and I started to ask the questions of why, why does this feel so weird to me? And in fact, it's because I realized New York City has one of the most segregated school systems in the country, and I was in a school that was 54% white, so the concept of diversity was very weird to me. It was abnormal. And I mention all these different things to kind of go back into this bigger picture. Whether you're Palestinian or whether you're a student fighting against school segregation, the constant theme is trying to tackle the othering of people. When you have segregation, when you have apartheid, when you have the physical separation of people, whether it's in schools or whether it's in nation states, it is ultimately the same outcome, right? It's the same concept of trauma. It's the same injustice. It's the same, the allocation of resources. When we understand that unification and working to actually bring different types of people together, that's, in my opinion, like what is so important to me. But that's not to convolute the concept of like just assimilation and losing a lot of our values to succumb to this idea, for example, of what it means to be American. Because for me, although I call myself American, if you asked me, if you asked me, kind of what it means, I would kind of look at you in a weird way. I'm like, this is what it means, and it's the concept of diversity, right? My opinion on this whole conversation, I know I'm like doing a long-winded answer for this, but again, like whether like my work is focused on Islamophobia, education, inequities, or Palestine, it's this concept of trying, to bring people together, to embrace difference, not step away from it.
And I mean, you grew up in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and the response to those attacks, which was so difficult for Muslim children and Muslim families all over this country. Describe your experience.
I remember there was a specific...
How old were you?
Yeah, so in middle school I was around maybe 10, 11 years old. During 9/11 I was like 1, but yeah, I'm young. Anyway, so, after, when I was in middle school, when I specifically remember this day when Osama bin Laden was killed, the next day in class, I had students ask me what my opinion was. And I didn't think at like 10 years old I had to have an opinion on an issue of like national security or an issue on politics. So when I was young, I was super politicized. I mean, being Palestinian Muslim, you're already politicized, but the concept of all of these events, like you just had to know, you had to be informed, you had to constantly defend and justify yourself. You had to understand, like, why is this, it's one thing being reactionary and just if someone calls you a terrorist to kick them in the shin, but there's another aspect of really understanding, like, why is it that they think that. And so for a lot of Muslims and for a lot of Muslim youth, it is constant reflection. It is constantly trying to understand this nation's history, the history of, what happened on 9/11, the aftermath of 9/11, how many mosques were infiltrated, and Muslim student associations were infiltrated, how many of our friends were political prisoners. I know a family that, was Dr. Samuel Arian. I advise all of you guys to really look into this story. And I know, Amy Goodman, you're very familiar with this. But how is someone who is just involved in their community, just a very outspoken person in their community, very active, and had to be sent to solitary confinement for 40 months for no other reason but for being Muslim? The United States government spent $50 million on this case to try to criminalize him into being a terrorist, and then they lost. So it's, again, this whole conception of, being a Muslim, and even these political pundits are nowadays, like a few weeks, during the presidential elections, Hillary Clinton specifically said that, we need to work with the almost moderate Muslims, the good Muslims in the communities to try to bring people together. We have to work with the Muslims. We can't isolate them. Even that rhetoric is we are not even considered as Americans. We're considered as, if we're moderate and we're one of the good ones, we have to leave all of our Islamic values, to be this concept of American. I mean, yeah, so sorry, it's all over the place, but.
Don't apologize. So what was your feeling when Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar were elected to Congress?
So I definitely felt happy, but if I can give my candid and open opinion.
It's the only opinion you can give.
I'm not very interested in identity politics. I'm not very interested in, the whole concept, although I am very thrilled that we do have diversity within our Congress now. I'm not convinced that, just because you're Muslim, just because you're Black, just because you're Palestinian, it automatically means that you know what's right. In my opinion, I think they have to prove themselves. And I think that, and although they have in their local communities, we live in a country, we live in a society where you have multi-billion-dollar corporations buying our politicians left and right. So I'm fearful that, they may succumb to the pressure, but I am hopeful. So although I may seem cynical, I want to caution us from just kind of like buying into the notion that, oh, wow, Palestinian, oh, wow, Muslim, then that means that they're inherently good. Because as we know, you have a diversity of, like, dictators, so.
Ramon, today the congressman from Parkland area in Florida. Ted Deutsch. Did you travel with him at all this summer? Was he a part of the tour?
He was with us
Come in and out
on election day for a bit, phone banking.
He said, what happened this week in the midterm elections with the flipping of the House of Representatives, he attributed it to the Parkland kids. He's attributed that flip to the Parkland kids. He said that their immediate response and, continually saying no BS and going to Tallahassee and demanding laws change, they may not have changed at the federal level. But in states around the country and in Florida, there were a massive number of changes. But it also gave people the sense, especially young people, that you can make a difference. And I thought it was very interesting to think about that and how many people much older than the kids themselves got inspired by them. And I'm wondering where you're going now after these midterm elections, what your plans are, because these are just midterm, which leads into 2020, and where you're taking this, your activism, where you see activism in this country should go.
Yeah. Just to comment on the first thing about the Ted Deutsch, it was not the Parkland kids. It was youth from all over the country that stood up, mobilized, and did the work that had to be done, right? The Parkland kids, they were able to get the media attention, but as soon as they were able to do that, they quickly distributed it to the rest of the country, right? This couldn't have been done with I'm not from Parkland. I'm part of the March for Our Lives team. This couldn't have been done without Alex King from Chicago, who's a youth peace warrior. Couldn't have been done without Brea Smith from Milwaukee, right? Who is on the Milwaukee Youth Council, has been fighting gun violence since she was like 14 years old, right? March for Our Lives, this movement of young people, isn't just a bunch of kids from a suburban area in Parkland. This is about a movement that is inclusive, that has young people from every corner of this country putting in the work that's necessary. So America was able to flip the house. America's youth was able to flip the house, not Parkland kids. And for what's next, yeah, wow. I literally just flew back into New York yesterday, and I would be honest, I'm exhausted, It's tiring. I mean, we traveled literally all summer, and we the last 12 days leading up to the midterm election, we were out on the road again, going to those key districts, dorm storing on college campuses. We did a concert with DJ Khaled. Woo, that was pretty cool. And, election day was very emotional just because when you put your all into something, when you sacrifice sleep, I took a gap year. I didn't go to school. I cared about this that much that I said my time is is much better worth, doing this work than going to college. And, the results were, the House flipped. We're in a better position. Florida, unfortunately, it's still in a little rocky place, but with the recounts, I hope that, the truth will come out about who actually won this election, especially in Georgia, where Stacey Abrams, who is an amazing woman, an amazing candidate who deserves to be the governor of Georgia. I hope that the results, come in her favor.
This really is incredible in both places, that Stacey Abrams said no, she wasn't going to concede. Now, today, Brian Kemp, the man she opposed, the Republican Secretary of State, who was the ref and the player, right, who refused to step down overseeing the election as he ran. Today, he resigned as Secretary of State. And says he's preparing to be governor. And she says, no, I'm preparing too to be governor. But also both races in Florida, right? Andrew Gillum, who did concede on Tuesday, is that race may now go into a recount.
Well, it officially did go into a recount.
As it should.
Yeah, it did. It is a recount.
And then also Nelson versus the governor, Scott, will go into a recount. These are amazing moments.
But yeah, we have to continue the push, right? Just a lot of people are saying, oh, the House is flipped, we've won. No, this is just the beginning, right? We're at a place where our country could begin to heal, right? And in order to begin to heal, we need to continue to hold those elected officials accountable. It doesn't matter if they're new, if it's their first time serving, if they're a Democrat, if they have a D next to their name. That doesn't matter. There's still work to be done. They're still representing us. Our elected officials work for us, the people, not the other way around, right? So we need to continue to push them. We need to continue to hold them accountable. And, for the work that March for Our Lives is doing, right now we have all of our policy points. We're working on our legislative agenda, and we're going to the Hill, and we're planning, on bringing young people with us to the steps of the Capitol to demand the laws that we all demanded for this summer, right? And the fight doesn't end, and enough about national elections. I mean, local elections. Here in New York City, we got the city council races coming up, right? Those elections matter much more, especially when we're talking about gun violence. Especially
Are you going to be running?
Huh?
Are you going to be running?
I got to go to college. That comes first. But when we're talking about segregated, New York City schools, which New York City is one of the most segregated school systems in the country, along with Milwaukee, we have to pay attention to those city council races, the people who decide our budgets, where the money is flowing. I mean, that's the important decision. That's the important votes, right? I mean, New York City has one of the worst school-to-prison system pipelines in the entire country. There's no reason why, young black and brown kids should have more security officers than guidance counselors in their schools, right? They should be having people there ready to guide them to college, not cells. So what's next is continuing to push people, to get them civically engaged, because we have local elections coming up, and those matter much more than those national ones. And we always have to continue to vote and continue to go out there, GOTV, because like Brea said, it was just in my head and I lost it. Wow. That's, yes, can you repeat that?
Wanting voting to be normal, not necessarily popular. Popular fades, normal.
It needs to be normal. It needs to be normal. I mean, it's so many of my ancestors, died for the right, for me to vote, right? For so many of us to vote, right? And there's no reason why we shouldn't be out there being civically engaged. And I understand that sometimes it can be hard to vote. I mean, being a woman, where now it's amazing. We have 100 women that, are in Congress. But before, a Congress that never represented women, right? I mean, Brett Kavanaugh, what the fuck? It's hard for a Muslim American to vote when the country doesn't even see them as American, right? It's hard for a black and brown person to vote when this country just criminalizes them, right? But when we come together, when people from our communities run for office and they understand, then that's when we have to get out there and vote. That's why we need to recount that fucking vote in Georgia and Florida, and we need to continue to push, and that's what we're gonna do until we all die.
So, Brea, what are you doing leading up to in these next few years, and how has your activism changed, and how did you come to activism?
Yes, so I'm going to go backwards. So my activism also started when I was a student. I'm not anymore, so I feel like the old head over here. But I went to Yale, and I came from a very black and brown community in New York, so going to Yale was very shocking for me. I had lived most of my life not really believing I was a minority because everyone I lived around looked like me. We had such community. And so going to Yale was the first time that it was like, oh my gosh, this is where you all were. You were all here, hiding from me. But it was also the first time that I had been exposed to blatant racism as well. And I've been very shielded from that because even as a black woman, I have the privilege of being lighter skinned and sometimes racially ambiguous, depending how my hair looks. So I still was shielded from a lot of it, but still it was a very jarring experience. And I was going to college also when social media was more of a thing and when Black Lives Matter happened. I was a freshman when Trayvon Martin was killed, and that was what really got me engaged. I was studying abroad that summer, and I was just holed up in my room, and my homestay mother was like, you never go out, you come all the way here, and you never
Where were you?
I was in Paris, and she's like, you never go anywhere, and I was like, the trial is happening. I cannot not be looking at my screen right now, and when the acquittal came in, it was the first time that I truly felt oh, wow, nothing matters. There's nothing that you can do. You can try your best, you can go to Yale, and you can still be gunned down. And then it was my junior year when a peer of mine was held at gunpoint by Yale police for fitting the description of someone from the New Haven community. And again, it was no matter where you go, you can be leaving the library, and if police think that you could maybe be, they'll ask questions later. So that's how I got involved, and criminal justice was my entry point. And as a sophomore, I started volunteering with Justice League NYC. And that is led by Carmen Perez, an amazing woman who's also the national co-chair of Women's March. And so I was volunteering with them, and especially when Eric Garner was killed here in New York, getting really engaged in the organizing around there. But it didn't feel like something that I could do as a career. So I was very engaged in activism as a student, and especially my senior year at Yale, there were really protests that got national attention, and I'm not sure if people know about that, but so I was very engaged, and I just didn't know what to do with that when I graduated. So I graduated, and I went to Southeast Asia, and I was working at Yale's proxy school there, and then a few months into being there was when Donald Trump was elected, and it was scary. It was really weird, but I think the weirdest thing was knowing that the world continued for everyone else. Not being in the US was such a strange thing because my world was revolving around what was happening back home, and the world was going on. And that was when I sort of realized that it's very easy to think that you can make one post or be engaged for these couple months, and then you do your own thing and you travel and you go on with your day job and you can plug out. But that is how that happens, is when we get apathetic or when we get complacent and we think that someone else is gonna fix what just happened in the US. And I can be here in Singapore and not care. And that was something that I forced myself out of. And I think that that's what I was so proud of working with Women's March, was that I think we helped a lot of people do that. A lot of people who marched said that that was their first time marching. They'd never been a part of something like that before. And they said it with a badge of honor, but it was really oh my gosh, we have failed. That people can live their lives and not feel invested in what their neighbors are going through, in what other people in their communities are going through. And that's when I realized that regardless of whether it was a career or not, I needed to be spending every day working towards that. And gratefully, you know, I was able to, I now work at the Gathering for Justice, but that's what I think the win is that people are now realizing that they can't look away. They have to stay vigilant at all times. They need to be always watching, because the moment you look away is when Trump gets elected and Kavanaugh gets put in and everyone's getting fired and media is being attacked. And the moment you look away, we have to always be watching.
You know, we're going to be wrapping up and going upstairs, and I hope you will enjoy Activists New York. By the way, the book is amazing, and the exhibit is wonderful. And when you first come in, you mentioned Eric Garner. You see I Can't Breathe, and you see the exhibit around police brutality. And on the other aisle, you see the story of David Ruggles, you know, the activism that goes so far back. David Ruggles, who had a printing press in Lower Manhattan. It's now an independent coffee shop, but it has a plaque outside. And when Frederick Douglass was in Maryland, he was born in the eastern shore of Maryland, and he was enslaved as a teenager, and he was taken to a place called Mount Misery and beaten, because that's where troublesome slaves, the troublemakers, were taken. He fought back. He freed himself. He escaped. He came north and took refuge, because David Ruggles' printing press was part of the Underground Railroad, in that building with David Ruggles. And, you know, Frederick Douglass started the North Star newspaper, and David Ruggles had that printing press. It's so interesting that both of them found the media was their form of liberation, that information is power. And so it's so wonderful to be here at this history museum that brings the activism of centuries to life, that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, that we all can draw from this tremendous creativity and defiance and resistance in this remarkable city we live in. I'm wondering, since we're wrapping up right now, in this last minute, if you each want to share a sort of pearl of wisdom, what inspires you to educate young and old here, because I think it crosses generations.
So I think for me, there's this one point that a teacher of mine in high school used to hammer down. And this is when, you know, Bernie Sanders was a big thing, and I was really into him at the time. Then he stopped me for a second and he said, voting is a minuscule part of democracy. And in essence, that concept to me like really stuck, and I really started to realize that it's what happens after. You know, it's what happens on the day-to-day. It's what happens when you, you know, the concept of looking to your neighbor, because the reality is these issues that we're having in America of not caring for each other has been an issue since the inception of America. And so I think something we all need to take into account is really try to be, you know, have the community over the individual, really focusing on trying to build community and less about, you know, building the individual, because a movement, by the way, is not just, you know, MLK and Malcolm X, it's the thousands that helped and organized with them. So I guess I'll leave off with that.
There's a quote in the Quran that I used to read for a very long time. Is those who tread the earth peacefully, those who tread the earth gently, when approach with ignorance, respond only in peace. And to me, that spoke truths. You know, out of many, we are one. We have to love our neighbors. We have to care for our neighbors. We have to ask people if they're okay. You know, the only way we're going to progress as a country is with love, unity, and just love. I mean, we have to love one another. And if we can get to that point where we're actually caring about each other and our neighbors, then I have hope for this country. I have hope that we can become the country that, you know, so many other people believe can become great, you know. But with peace, love, and unity, it's how we win. And out of many, we are one. Love your neighbors. Love each other.
Well, you both just like hit it right on the head. I was actually gonna say what you said, and then I was like, oh, then you said it. So I think what I'll leave you with is something that my mentor, Carmen Perez, does at the conclusion of every time that she speaks, which is to ask everyone to stand, including us. And I'm gonna ask you to repeat after me, first in just regular speaking tone. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and protect one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. So now we're going to do it so that the people in the gallery can hear us. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. It is our duty to win. We must love and protect one another. We must love and protect one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. We have nothing to lose but our chains. And now so Trump can hear us all the way in D.C. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. It is our duty to win. We must love and protect one another. We must love and protect one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Take that with you. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you all so much for coming out, and these wonderful folks are going to be there to talk to you at the exhibit, and books are going to be signed. And I encourage all of you to tune into Democracy Now! Every day, whether on Manhattan Neighborhood Network or democracynow.org, on radio on WBAI 99.5 FM, wherever you can. Support independent media, which is committed to going to where the silence is.
Thank you so much, Amy, Brea, Ramon, and Hebh. Let's have another round of applause for our amazing panel. And what an incredible and inspiring note to end on. We now ask that you join us upstairs on the museum's second floor for a drink and to continue the conversation and to take a look at Activist New York in the Puffin Gallery on the second floor. And then at 8 p.m., there will be, in the museum's rotunda on the first floor, a brief performance by Carnegie Hall's Future Music Project Ensemble. You can also purchase the amazing Activist New York book by my colleague Steve Jaffe on the first floor in our shops and get it signed by Steve himself. So thank you so much again, and let's keep the conversation going upstairs and beyond. Thank you.